Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory, YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway. Because everybody, as much as we try to affect the idea that there is a meritocracy in anything we do, everybody has a context, everybody has an actual subject position, and some of those subject positions are noisier than others. So I truly thank folks who suffer through some of these pieces, even if there is a little screech of a truck or a motorcycle, sometimes pleasant noises. Occasionally you'll hear some macaws, which is quite nice, children, dogs, who knows. Actually, just before I started recording, there was a chiva that came by. It's a party bus here in Colombia, and those people were having a really great day, but they almost disrupted my recording with a lot of booming music, which maybe you would have enjoyed, who knows. The reason that this especially matters, I talk about this in relation to science fiction a lot, because there's that intersection, that maybe sometimes an intervention between the human world and the mechanical world and the natural world that is core, intrinsic to the themes of science fiction. And yet, this whole notion of chaos at the periphery also works really well when talking about independent publishing, self-publishing, which is the topic today. And we've talked about this, I think, a few times before. We will every now and again talk about this because it is important. For those who can see the screen, there are two books in particular that we're going to use for this conversation today. But as always, I love not to do a specific review of the work so much as to put it in context, to have a real conversation around the materiality of the work and the culture that makes it possible. And these two authors are definitely old enough to have come up, like I did, through many different movements in our industry. And we are all old enough to remember a time when you had to go out and buy your own writer's market guide, and it had to be up to date, so you'd have to get one for every new year with all the addresses of the agents and the places to mail your beloved work that you carefully printed out and you put together, assembled in an envelope with, in my particular case, a self-addressed stamped envelope for return from U.S. markets to Canada, with, if you wanted to have that lovely personal rejection, or even a form rejection, but an actual material object. Moving into the digital realm created a lot of promise for some, but it was often a false promise, because the floodgates opened and the industry changed to match. And we've talked about this before. The industry changed to match in large part by changing the role of literary agents. A lot of presses that had originally been open to all kinds of manuscripts suddenly shut their doors to anything that didn't come through an agent. And the agent became the bottleneck. The agent became extremely important. So we have this tension in our field now, where the internet gives us this sense of boundless possibility, especially with social media. My goodness, you can connect with anybody. And it has, in some cases, borne fruit. It has allowed for some connections. But often there is this gloss of cosmopolitan sentiment, of a sense of global connection that hides the fact that we still very much are a regional body of literatures and a set of regional communities. You're part of a specific workshop that happens to be close to a major literary publishing hub. That means you're going to be able to go to conferences, actually talk to editors, talk to agents in person, and that tends to be where the magic gets made. So even though we do have this tremendous realm of possibility to connect with many people, there are still core material connections that play out and serve people much better when it comes to getting into actual publishing houses. We also have this huge shift, and we've talked about this before, to a kind of prestige publishing that didn't exist in science fiction and fantasy for a very long time. Science fiction and fantasy was considered a highly pulp genre, and that did help a lot of writers to be able to scratch out a living if they worked really hard at it, if they hustled, if they kept churning work out. The quality of the work would be a little bit rougher, It would be a little bit more, I hate to say prosaic because that's kind of a redundant term, it is prose, but there would be less of a focus necessarily on the beauty of the sentences, that kind of lyrical lift, and more on a very functional kind of storytelling. And it's seen in short story fiction magazines as well as in a lot of the pulps from that era, which are different from the kind of stylized forms you get now, especially, again, new marketplaces, from the rise of MFAs, which is not something that has existed throughout most of literary history. Most of literary history, if you had a degree, it was a degree in history, philosophy, or your native language, or maybe comparative lit. But now we have these specialized programs, which are, again, opportunities to create connections between people who, to be able to get that opportunity and use it, are probably already in a kind of similar class bracket. They already have similar aesthetics. So, again, we have this sense of the internet with all of its possibilities, promises, that anyone can make it, that we can all succeed, that there will be space for all creative practice. And in some cases, it creates some good communities to grow as a writer. But it also sometimes hides the fact that there are still hard limits. And that was all before what Cory Doctorow has called the enshittification of things. And it's just a good term. It's one of many for these cycles for our digital products. Our online media has a life cycle that first encourages everyone to be on the same platform and do the same things, and then make the quality of the product that one uses on that platform inferior. Because once you have audience capture, then you can move on to using that audience. They have no other choice. They have nowhere else to go. And that's unfortunately the way things are right now for independent publishing. Amazon is still one of the most dominant providers of a promise that you too can be a published author, and you too can make it even if you couldn't get through the bottleneck of the literary agents who are very much tied to certain scenes, certain trend cycles, in order to appease a very specific number of more high prestige industry presses. Prestige maybe isn't even the correct word for it, but there is definitely a selectivity, and it's often decided, these tastemakers are often decided really high up the chain. It's not even the big five so much as the parent companies for the big five. So we're talking about some private equity firms, hedge funds. There are a lot of people really high up the chain who decide that the publishing companies are really going to focus on a few summer hits and everything else is B or C list. And that means that even writers who get in the traditional way are often burned up, used up very quickly for one catalog, and when their work doesn't succeed because it wasn't the one chosen to be promoted, then they fall to the margins and they have a really tough mid-career. So it's hard. And I don't want to say any of this to suggest that one way is better than the other. It's just that independent publishing is extremely hard, and it very rarely pays out. People do it for a number of reasons, but if anybody is doing it thinking, oh, I'm never going to make money from this, they are unfortunately a rare few, because the vast majority still hope. They've got a platform and they're going to try to use it. And there are many ways that people try to use it, and sometimes with a lot of hustle, you can definitely make coin, but you have to be really careful about it. On the SFF blog, there is a series, the Indie Files, and I'll link that in the show notes here today, where there are wonderful pieces by the Indie Committee on SFF, and this is a rolling series. They'll have more pieces coming up. We're in conversation with them for the next round. They just got a new person in charge of the committee, and we're really looking forward to working with him to set up the next few. But it's really important to hear from the voices of people who are actually in the trenches. And there are so many ways to be in the trenches. Another thing that we're doing at the SFF blog is creating some conversations about use of social media and newsletters to try to promote one's work. Is it a good idea? Is it a time sink? These are questions we have to ask across the board, because ultimately indie publishing is one of those very dangerous areas in publishing where the maxim in the writing life and in the creative life doesn't hold. Usually, what we warn fellow writers about is that money should always flow to the writer. And it should. If you're working with a traditional publisher, you absolutely should be receiving money, not paying for anything. And if any publisher is asking you to pay for something, that's a red flag. Please report it to SFF has an alert system for just the situation. There are other places as well. Writers Beware is extremely important if a traditional press is trying to ask you to do the work that a press should be doing. And what does a press do? Promo. Whether you get lots of promo or little, it should be them doing it. Although they might ask you to do things like social media posts, that's not going to cost you money. But if they're asking you to pay, that is dangerous. The traditional press takes care of cover art. It takes care of editing. It is extremely important to look into the press, especially if it's a smaller press that you're working with, to make sure that they are actually going to be helping you in those ways, or else why partner with them? But when you are an indie writer, suddenly all costs are on you. And again, there is a chance of payout if you hustle really well. And some of the best ways of hustling that I've seen from some of the indie pieces that we've published and that I've heard from other indie writers is in-person works so much better. If you can go to local events, if you can go to fairs, if you can go to conventions, if you can go to local libraries and shows, if you can set up shop somewhere, even out of the trunk of your car if you need to, that still works really well with material copies to spread your name and to build up a little bit of brand recognition. This works. This is one of the major problems. The lie of the online world is that it tries to strip us from an understanding of the fact that we are still material beings who occupy a context, and whether we intend to or not, we are biased toward the material and the physical and the local and the regional. So keep that in mind. We'll not veer too much more into that, but I'm trying to set a context here. And the context is that independent writers take on all of those tasks from traditional publishing, and they have to be extremely careful about how much they invest, because they have to recognize that they're probably not going to get that money back. They're probably going to be very lucky if they break even on their budgeting. That is normal. And some will say, that's fine, I got my work out there. Maybe. But you don't want to burn yourself out along the way. I mean, last year I tried to do indie publishing myself, and I did. I published a few works, but it definitely, I had a low budget, and I still had a really tough time breaking even for that. That's common. But on top of that, the amount of work that you have to put into all that marketing side really burns you out for anything else. So I'm shifting back to short fiction practice for the next little while, because that's a part of the industry in which I can build it and utilize relationships with more traditional presses to recoup costs. It just happens. It's important going in to have reasonable expectations. If you want your work to go out there, if you believe in your story, yes, absolutely, you can use these forums. But you should be very cautious about the amount of money you spend on advertising and where you spend money on advertising. There are many independent advertising outfits, like liminal fiction, for instance, that are much better in some ways than paying for Amazon, just because Amazon right now has made it's such an oppressive pricing scheme that you really have to pay a lot to receive anything in terms of benefit on the algorithms. They have so much market share that they really don't have an incentive to care too much about how high your work goes in the rankings. So find your audience, find your niche communities, look for alternative promotional strategies. That's important. And then again, think about the price point. Think about how much you're going to spend. Cover art is also important and definitely difficult. The temptation is strong to use AI, but not actually helpful whatsoever in the long run. There is a lot of public domain work that one can use if you know where to look. So if you are not able to afford an artist, there are still options that won't cause too many problems down the line. It is probably still a good idea, if you don't have much design experience, to think about that, because it's part of your marketing strategy. It is important to the first impression that people get of your work. But again, you need to be careful about price points. So cover art and cover design can range widely. And if you can pay up to $1,000, as some people do, that's great that it's a possibility. Just think about whether it is something that's going to serve the work. Really think about your budget. And that brings us to the other part of the budget, which is for editing. And everyone needs an editor. I'm an editor, and I need editors for my own work too. Everyone misses things. Everyone gets caught up in the syntax and the natural rhythm of language in their mind, and they do need someone to give them a little nudge. And also sometimes to point out problems that simply come from having read one's text over and over and over again. Sometimes it gets too familiar. The first thing I would do, I recommend this to everybody, is that if you can't afford an editor, at the very least, change the font on your piece. After you think you've finished it, after you think that you've caught all the errors, change the font to something drastically different but still readable. So if you're working, I don't know why anyone would be working in an Arial. Nobody would. Maybe some of you are Arial people. I don't understand your kind, but okay. Imagine, let's say you're doing a narrow font like Arial. Switch over to a Courier or something that's wide, and that's going to change the line endings. It's going to change the paragraph endings. It's going to change where different words fall and the weight on different letters. And when you do that, you make the text strange to yourself, which means that the next time you read it, you will catch more errors. It will happen naturally. There are other techniques. Reading out loud is a really good one, especially around dialogue. I've learned this especially from doing an audiobook version of a book in progress that I wasn't able to sell to the traditional presses, so I've been publishing it on Patreon. But as I do the audiobook version, I'm constantly correcting things simply because when I say them, I realize, oh no, that's the way it's written is awkward syntax, and so I adjust the syntax on the page to match. That helps too, but if it's a long work that might be difficult, you don't want to read the whole thing out loud. And another good strategy is to read backwards, to start from the bottom of your work and go back 1 or 2 lines at a time, 1 paragraph at a time. Out of context from the rhythm of the story, you will catch more things. And you're actually more likely when you do that to notice when you are repeating certain gestures and words. So that's a useful strategy. So those are some free strategies you can use without paying someone to help. One of the authors that I want to talk about today paid me to edit his work. But I want to be very clear about the fact that he and I had a conversation about this first, because there is a whole industry of people who prey on independent writers who are so eager to publish their work, who are so eager to get their great story out there that they will pay anything. Great, I suppose. I mean, thank you for your business, right? But it is a bit exploitative if the editor is promising something that's a little bit unfair. And it is extremely important to remember that just as I can't control the sounds of my highway in the background, and it's getting a little bit chaotic out there, nor can an editor control the marketplace. And just because the editor is going to set a certain price point for their work, because it is work, it does take work, it takes training to be able to do the work really well, and it does take a lot of time to do well. Nonetheless, you have to balance the amount of money you're investing in editing with expectations of payout. Do you want a high quality product? Okay, get yourself a good editor. But know going in that the editor's quality of writing is not necessarily Well, it can't help you sell the book immediately. It might help when it comes to first reviews, but for the average reader who comes to your page, there are going to be other things that get them to that click. And I edited the piece itself. I'd read an earlier version, and then I formally edited a later version after it had gone through beta reading. I did not edit the copy for the blurb for the promotional materials for this work, and I would recommend that that's something you might also want to consider if you don't have a budget for a full editor. At least get somebody to help you with that promotional material, that back of book copy. And the back page copy is so important. It's its own art form, and there are so many ways to make it snappy. And so if you do need, if you use the other methods and you have some confidence in yourself as an editor, you can probably get away with a lighter touch on the full editing if cost dependent. If you can pay for it, editing is good. But you definitely should consider making sure that somebody is covering that blurb content. In this case, I, again, edited the work itself, and I did this after the conversation, after I warned the author, because the important point was going in with expectations, and this is a very pragmatic author who has invested in many different ways. As a result, I can't really review the work, but I am going to talk about the work anyway. I'm going to talk about the work in the context of the ways that indie publishing, for all of these problems, create a space for kinds of literature that, for whatever reason, are not really going to find a space in today's prestige market. So this comes down to why people self-publish anyway. And both of these books, I read them realizing almost immediately, I can see why these books are not going to be finding favor right now in traditional publishing for different reasons. The first one, Plea to a Frozen God by C.M. Skiera, that's the one that I edited. I saw an earlier version, I gave some comments about structure, about plot, and then the later version was a copy edit followed by a proofread. And I mean that in two ways. I did the copy edit in one direction, looking structurally, looking at problems in the text, looking at problems in characterization, a lot of consistency details, world building details. This all goes into a standard full edit. Then I read backwards for the proof to make sure that every little detail is taken care of on a technical level. So again, a lot of work goes into a proper job, and you really want to get a sense of what your editor is going to be capable of before you invest any money in that, especially as an indie published author. But on top of that, this is the kind of work that probably would have sold if we weren't in an era of prestige science fiction and fantasy. This is the kind of work that definitely has an audience because it resonates with a lot of playthroughs, a lot of role-playing games that we love as a culture. There's a whole niche market of people who love these kinds of journey quests. So Plea to a Frozen God has three core characters. We have Prince Lego, who starts the way that most of these kinds of characters do in these novels. He is new to the ordeals of life outside of his fairly cozy existence. He has a difficult, challenging realm. His father is definitely a little bit of a strong force, trying to manage all kinds of internal enemies, external enemies, and also natural phenomena that are changing. The landscape is changing on the world, and it's very clearly, we know that it's kind of an alt medieval setting. We know that there are other species which suggest it's another world. And very quickly in the work, you're probably going to click to the fact that it is in fact another world, just from the chapter openings, which have these little tiny excerpts from a tale that comes together to explain how this world was created. So you know and you build in that awareness that ultimately this world was populated by some figures from another planet at one point. And so it does have a science fiction component. But within the culture itself, everything is medieval in terms of its understanding of the world, and there's a lot of mysticism, and there are questions about how real that mysticism is, which that there are fantastical components too. So that is this blending of forms. Prince Lego is going to have a journey quest where from circumstances that happen early on, he is thrust out because his family has been murdered, taken by a rival group that was supposed to marry into his through him to settle some disputes, and instead it became this dramatic act that drives this young man from his home. But he doesn't really have many skills. He blanches at the sight of death at the beginning. He's very fragile in many ways. So if it weren't for Mystic Riggin, who is another important character here, she's the mystic. She holds a high position in the court and in the culture, and you don't really know how much of her powers are real or fantastical until very late in the book, because of a very fascinating plot device involving another character, Sergeant Fry, that they find along the way. A person who is the last remainder of a slaughtered military contingent that was supposed to protect the realm from invaders and failed, unfortunately. And so this is a bit of his redemption arc. She's protecting the prince, trying to get him to a secret sanctum where his mother is supposed to be, and has apparently valiantly been working for years to try to settle the gods, especially their god, who seems to have abandoned them and left them to these but right now really active volcanoes that are imperiling the entire world. So they have an objective, and we have these three core characters, and again, it's the kind of setup you would love in any kind of role-playing game adventure. We have this mystic character, we have this beleaguered and traumatized military character with this last chance at redemption, and we have this hapless royal who has to learn as he goes how to survive, what's true, what's not, teasing through many of the things he's been led to believe. And when they get to the sanctum too, they have to uncover mysteries that are going to shatter their entire belief system in the gods, as we know, because all along we readers are getting a clear sense that there is something otherworldly about this whole world and culture. So I mention this, I lay this context out because, again, there were whole eras where you would find a book like this on a spinner rack, and you would just be able to pour yourself into an adventure. I mean, there are elements to this piece that wouldn't be entirely out of place with something by Eddings, for instance. Although we don't really talk about Eddings anymore because of some really horrible things. So many people in our genre are terrible people. But you know what I mean. The military fantasy moment existed, and it was a really good one. You'd be able to pick up a lot of these kinds of adventure quest novels, and you'd always have a character who was learning on the road, and you'd have these adventures that would scale up their understanding of the world. You'd have these strange mysteries from other characters like the mystic, and these questions of redemption, these deeper themes, these heavier senses of generations of hurt through other characters still in their party. And they did really well for a spell, and I think they would still do well now. It's just that we don't invest in them as much. There are fewer publications that actually focus on launching this kind of work, and so you have authors that are committed to these quest adventures. And again, they're things that are very confident. This isn't just a ripoff of a D&D adventure. I want to be very clear about that. But it is something that is familiar to and beloved to a large slice of our genre that doesn't necessarily get representation right now in our prestige-driven presses. So, PLEA to a Frozen God is the kind of thing that if you enjoyed those military fantasies, those adventure quest fantasies of a different era, Dragon Quest, there's another one. Like we had so many. Yeah, there was a different time, and it was a wonderful time. I remember as a kid just really knowing that I could pick up any maybe gilded covered piece from that spinner, and I would just be thrown into a completely different world for an hour or 3, and it was nice. Now, because we have so much focus on prestige, it's a little bit harder to find those works, but they exist, and there are authors who love them and love to add to that tradition, and that's what we have here with this piece. So again, I can't give a review because I did edit this, and I did see an earlier draft, so I've been with this author on their journey for a while. But I will say that the market for this piece probably exists, even though there is no major press backing right now to the same extent that there was in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when we had just a flourishing of these kinds of pieces. So it goes. I mean, everything has its time and place, but that's where indie publishing comes in, to allow authors to try to find and reach those niches who haven't changed. Like, because we have such a role-playing culture, you know that people are still interested in these kinds of quest narratives. They're just not served by mainstream publishing right now. The question, though, is, as an indie writer, how many of us can pour our effort, our time, our money into these things well enough to be able to connect and rebuild those communities? So we try our best, because it's worth it, because the voices that are being represented on these pages are speaking to something that exists in our culture just as it did in previous generations. So that's one example. And the other one, too, is a perfect example of what indie publishing can serve in terms of not just addressing niche genres, although this is a very niche genre, but also opportunities to explore and play, which is not something that we really get necessarily in our mainstream traditional prestige publishing universe. So the second piece is by Joyce Reynolds-Ward. It's The Cost of Power, Book 1, Return. And it is part of a sprawling series. It is the first of that series that I've read, which is an interesting starting point. After I read the piece, I went back and I looked at some of the blurbs from the other pieces in the series. The Martiniere Legacy is a massive universe, and it's undergone a few different branding pitches over time. So when the first pieces came out, it was pitched as an agripunk thriller. Agripunk meaning that it was set on agricultural context, very much focused on a ranch. We have definitely, horses are a huge part of this, and the entire kind of rural culture that comes with it is a huge part of the work. And in the earlier pieces, the agripunk has to do also with the idea of innovation to agriculture, sci-fi components coming into play with all kinds of new technologies that might improve the landscape. And of course, with all of that, you get the drama, you get essentially the cartels, the mafias, the different groups that are trying to maintain control of the land and of the technology and of the people. And so the earlier works, quite interesting to read up on the stories. I'm hesitant to say much about them because I'm going to be talking specifically about this one. I will say this one is an extension of a big, sprawling family drama that plays out in these other works, and yet it also stands alone for a very, very big reason. It is a multiverse story. It is a slightly alternative version of what happens to the characters in the original timeline. And it's done here so that the author can play with notions of culpability, which again builds into this broader theme about responsibility and power. There are so many important parts to the story that I'm trying to figure out exactly where to pop in. But I will say that while the first series was promoted as an agripunk thriller, this one has been presented as science fantasy neo-western. What does that mean? Well, obviously the science fantasy, the science fiction is there. The fantasy is there too, because the Martiniere name is extremely important to how this author has decided to reconfigure notions of those sort of gangs and cartels and mafias, these big organizations that are usually tied into Western stories. So I'm talking about anything from Longmire to Yellowstone. We have these big dramatic dramas about the West. Outer Range? Outer Range as well. We have many stories set in the West where you have land just doing its thing, existing, and a few people on it just trying to do their thing, exist, manage a little ranch, take care of their family, and this larger than life sense of corporate overreach or any kind of encroachment from heritage through the family line. And that's been taken to a different level here. It has been taken to an intense level. We have notions of old world feuds carried forward and old world families reaching out and impacting the American landscape. So the Western here has been literally infused with the notion of a very select family lineage that goes back to ancient old world family lines. And there's power in this one line. The Martiniere's power has some really complex overlays. It ties into some of the technology in recent generations, but before then it seems to have leaned as well on the fantasy part, in the sense that there is something very special, maybe a little bit magical about the family line that allowed for these kinds of codified rituals to have a kind of magic to them. And so all of this is coming to bear on the page. We have these, and again, this version, the book that I read, is a multiverse version, which leans a little bit more. It's first of a series of 3 that's going to lean more into the fantasy side as it goes on, to really explore some of that deeper power, that deeper mythology in the family line. And on the page, how does it look on the page? Let me say, it is a whirlwind on the page. My goodness. At first, I was a little bit overwhelmed, because I thought, wow, there's a word in our culture that has a lot of negative association right now, but I just talked about things like Longmire and Yellowstone and Outer Range, and these are pieces that are quite dramatic, to the point that we might also use the word melodrama for them. The problem is, right now, when we say melodrama, it has a negative connotation, but quite a few of our grand family stories are melodramas, and this is whew, there's so much. So when you start reading this piece, and you can read this on its own, because even though it is connected to a larger world, Reynolds-Ward definitely gives you everything you need to know to catch you up. And it is a whirlwind of catch-up, my goodness. There's just so much weighing on all of the characters as they move through every decision. So we have Gabe, who's actually Gabriel Martiniere. He's going to, in the course of this book, accept the fact that he has to come forward and reclaim his connection to the family, even though he tried to leave that whole nasty business behind and just live in a kind of anonymous rancher life, connected to a brilliant woman he adores very much, Ruby, who is spectacular in every which way. I mean, she's rodeo queen, she's got her own ranch, and she's got a fantastic stable set up for herself there. She's also, at the same time, she's also incredibly savvy when it comes to new tech and new tech developments that might be useful for improving agriculture going forward. So she's the whole package. And he'd be very content just to continue in his way with her, but he is going to very quickly have to own up to who he is in this piece and deal with the consequences of returning to the family, to protect the family and to protect what the family tries to protect, which is hopefully a world that isn't going to be so compromised by all this new technology and all of the surrounding consequences for culture that it becomes a truly inhumane place in which to live. It already is in some ways. There are systems of indentured servitude already in play that are quite awful. You'll note the timestamp in this piece, which is a very near future, which would suggest very clearly that this is a multiverse novel, because many of the things that would have needed to have happened for that story to take place in the time it does haven't happened yet. So we know we're in a multiverse. But this multiverse is rough. Imagine if all of our current technocrats were instead tied into these long-standing sort of regal family power plays, just their tendrils in Western culture and the New World, and you'd get a sense of this piece. So it has this sense still of the idea that you need these big, strong families to fix everything and control things, to defend against other big, strong families, which is a different approach to the world that we already have. But on top of that, the way that it's written, because it's so much focused on one family journey and these two characters, Gabe and Ruby, just trying to come into themselves and figure out their place in the world, you get a lot. It is a lot. I mean, just chapter after chapter of so many reveals, so many twists and turns, so many new things happening, inundated by all this history. And yet, even though I will say those kinds of family dramas are not my usual choice in terms of reading, I vividly remember so much of this book. It does hit you like there's a lot in there, and then it sticks with you, which is a testament to the confidence of the writing, the confidence in saying, this is what I'm writing. I am, my goodness, very excited noise in the background, hopefully in agreement with me on this. Very excited, emphatic writing that knows what it's trying to do, and it's trying to establish a scale of storytelling, a universe, which ties into the universe of the other work, and you get hints of that here, because later on in the work you'll get a sense that the characters have in some ways brushed up against these other elements of the multiverse. But you really don't need to know about the other multiverse just to immerse yourself in all of the ideas that are in play here about the consequences of technologies related to mind control, drone technology, labor forces in agriculture in the future. There's so much. So this is a world. It is a universe unto itself. And again, when I think about traditional publishing, I think to myself, there's so little space for this kind of writing anymore. I mean, you do sometimes get those tight trilogies, but we used to have cultures of big universes. Piers Anthony is a good example. We still do. We've got the Jordans, for instance. Not the Jordans, plural. Oh, is it? I guess I'm including family when I say that. We had this sense of you could start a series and the series would just sprawl. We had the culture novels, for instance. That was probably the last big push. But things tend to be a little bit tighter in scope now. And the kind of work that comes from being able to sit in a universe, being able to play with a universe, being able to look at different possibilities. Like I said, Reynolds-Ward wanted this series to reflect on elements that had not been fully explored in the first round. And the first round, obviously, was a little bit more on the tech side, the agripunk side. This one is going to, I can definitely get the hints of that, focus a little bit more on the deeper family lineage, the fantastical components, and yet still push around those ideas of power and culpability in different ways. So again, independent publishing creates space to do things that traditional publishing right now, with its focus on these tight, polished, prestige works, doesn't always allow for. We just don't get the same space for play. There's so much work like this that's being done. And I'm talking about two pieces that happen to be connected. If I talk again about the idea of these niche communities, by people I know. And so that allowed me to connect with them, that allowed me to talk about their work and to promote it, and to work with it to help one of the authors in particular. But when I reflect on all of this, I think to myself, wow, these are just 2 drops in a very big sea of people, of creators who are trying their best to find their audiences. And it's really hard. It's hard to decide where to put your funding. It's hard to decide if you're going to invest more in cover art or editing or publishing, promotion. And if you focus on promotion, where are you going to get the best value for your work? It's really tough. There was a time when there was profound stigma, and it used to be that self-publishing was just called vanity publishing, because you just had to be a vain person to want to share your work. And yet, I really strongly think that if we have a world of equity, wouldn't that be nice, first and foremost? Then we would have a world where people could be more creative in general, and they could spend more of their time pursuing these wonderful universes of their imagination. The world that we want to live in is one where people have enough already so that they can pursue the work that they want to do. That's not the world we have, though. We have a world where a lot of this kind of creative labor is, for many of us, the only way to scrape out any kind of a living, because there just isn't enough work to go around in the ways that we need. And that's hard. But on top of that, even though this is maybe a pathway for some people to hopefully getting something, it's an uneven pathway, and it's a promise that doesn't pay out well, and it leads to a lot of suffering and disappointment when people don't find it easy to find their audience, to connect. They have their stories they want to tell, they have their niches they want to serve, and it's really difficult to connect. As much as we can, we need to be kind to one another, and we need to uplift one another, and we need to honor the fact that if we do want to live in a world of greater equity, it's going to be one in which more people have an opportunity to explore their creative practice. But to get there, we still need to be able to support people on a material level too. So if either of these works strikes you, or if you just want to support an indie writer in general, there are definitely a lot of choices out there. But anyone who's looking for an adventure quest novel, a nice classic style, with some fun intermingling of science and fantasy, C.M. Skiera's Plea to a Frozen God might be something to look into. If somebody wants to dabble with a wallop of ideas, just so many, like just packed in this universe of twists and turns with family legacy and intrigue and all these different ways that new technology can lead to very difficult outcomes, then The Cost of Power Book 1 Return might open you into a full series of possibilities by Joyce Reynolds-Ward. And I guess that's where we're going to tie it up today, but this won't be the last time I talk about indie. I do try to talk about indie at least once every few videos, because it is a huge part of our industry right now. And again, the SFF blog does have this series, and it will continue to be added to with more work from the Indie Committee, which is a wonderful resource and a phenomenal group of people to get to know, to connect with, if you yourself are working in that vein. But above all, it's really important, if you as an author are struggling on the traditional path, first know that it is not your fault. It is an industry right now that promises so much, especially through the online world, which is an illusion of breaking down boundaries. It doesn't really break down as many boundaries as it pretends to. And in its place, we have this very difficult system in which we are all just trying to get by. So speaking of getting by, it is now the end of the time when I can expect any kind of peace and quiet from my highway. Only a tiny window on Sunday. So I'm going to sign off there, and thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate anyone who has liked and subscribed to this work and has suffered through the background noise especially. This has been ML Clark with Better Worlds Theory. As always, subscribing does help with algorithms. It's very annoying. Ooh, but nothing is going to help with the background noise for sure. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy whatever you are reading and whatever you are creating. Cheers.